G'day everyone. In this video we're going to be taking a look at a bit of an introduction into flight modes. So this video is aimed at pilots that are not familiar with flight modes. Those pilots that are familiar with flight modes, I'm sure they'll know how to use them. They're pretty handy. As a matter of fact, I've been using flight modes in all my transmitters since the late 1980s when I started to learn to fly model helicopters. Because in those days, not many transmitters actually featured flight modes, and it's really only the heli transmitters that sort of started off flight modes. So the very first heli transmitters in the late 1980s started to feature flight modes. And specifically for a heli, a flight mode was a necessity, because basically it allows you to configure different setups with a flick of a switch. So for a helicopter, for instance, we run different pitch depending on if you're in forward flight or hovering. Also, you probably have heard the term idle up in some cases. So that's an old helicopter term, again, probably from the late 1980s, early 1990s, where basically, you know, if you wanted to fly inverted or even just normal flight, you wanted some negative pitch on the collective stick, which is also our throttle stick. However, when you start your model, low stick is basically just idle, so just the engine's just idling away. However, when you were flying a helicopter around in the sky, if you wanted to bring it down, you basically had to reduce the collective pitch, which you did with the throttle stick, but you didn't want the motor to reduce back to idle. You wanted the motor to basically reduce to a set speed, or in some cases, if you're doing 3D like we do nowadays, you want the actual throttle to increase. So as you bring your throttle stick, say below half stick, in a lot of cases these days we actually increase the throttle. And using flight modes was a convenient way to have a different setup on your throttle stick, and also for your pitch curves and all that sort of stuff. And then later on, sort of in the late 90s, we started seeing flight modes appear in aircraft transmitters as well. And you know, there's not many transmitters these days that don't feature some sort of flight mode feature. Now, most of the radio systems call them flight modes. Futaba, for instance, do not call them flight modes though, they call them conditions. So if you hear the term conditions with Futaba, it's basically flight modes. It's the same thing. Okay, so what do flight modes allow us to do? Okay, for instance, setups. I mentioned setups when I was talking about the helicopters. So for fixed-wing pilots, you're probably familiar with, say, dual rates. So typically in the old days, you'd have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 switches to activate your dual rates. So you might have one for your aileron, one for your elevator, one for your rudder. And, you know, you could flick in different rates for your flight surfaces. With flight modes, what that allows you to do is basically have one switch to activate, say, your 3 different rates or more if you want. So basically it's like having one trigger to activate a whole lot of different setups. So it's not just rates, but things like, you know, expo. In the core, for instance, I'll show you when we have a look at the function menu. You can see we can adjust the curve. So in other words, the response of the flight surface, you can change that. We can also change the runtime of the servos. So if the servo's delayed for, you might have a unique function that you need to delay the runtime speed of the servo. You can change those runtime speeds. So there's a whole lot of configuration options. So if you think of a flight mode as a different memory or a different setup that you can choose from, so you might have, for instance, in the core, we have up to 13, including the default standard flight mode. There's 13 different flight modes. So you can select from one of 13 different setups, if you like, for your aircraft. So you can have an aircraft that might be quite docile. You can flick one switch and all of a sudden it becomes a 3D animal. And that's because, you know, you might change your rates, your gyro settings. There's a myriad of options that you can change. In this video, we'll go through and have a quick look at some of those features that we can change. So again, if you're new to this, if you're new to flight modes, just think of them as like a different memory that you can select for your aircraft, and you can have a totally different configuration pretty much. Okay, let's have a look at flight modes in the core anyway. Okay, so when we first enter the flight mode screen, you'll see all these little blank boxes with dashes in them, and underneath those are some more boxes that have standard written in them. And if I scroll across, you'll notice the diagram gets a little bit more complex, so it branches off to a few different options. So I'll explain that a little bit later. And you'll notice here we've got standard, 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 etc., etc. So that's the name of the flight mode. So when you first fire up a brand new model, which is what I've done here, go back into the menu, it fills out one flight mode as standard. And you'll notice that there's a light green line which basically goes up to standard, which is highlighted here. So that's the default single flight mode that it defaults to when it's first set up. So I haven't programmed any extra flight modes, but it's just using the standard flight mode. And if you also notice carefully, you'll notice standards written up the top here. So basically this flight mode also appears at the top of the screen. Okay, so what can we do? We've got all these flight modes, and then later on I'll show you how we can select all these different flight modes. So we could have, say, flight mode 1, 2, 3, you can call them whatever you like. Like for instance, some of my aircraft, I've got, say, like a landing flight mode, takeoff flight mode, and then I've got like flaps as flight modes as well. So I've got like half flaps, full flaps, and you can change the lettering obviously here. You can change the name of the flight mode, and basically that'll just appear in the tree here. But let's have a look to see what flight modes can do for us. So let's get out of here. If we go to the function menu, so as you remember, in the function menu, this is where we define all our functions basically. So for people not familiar with the core and atom or the PowerBox transmitters, a function is really, it's a bit like what your servos can do for a particular flight surface, or we call it functions because it doesn't have to be a flight surface. I mean, it could be like your ignition on-off switch, your lights, but typically, you know, we use these for functions, these functions for our flight surfaces to start off with, and then we can add, for instance, gear and whatever else we've got. So the PowerBox core and atom, they call that a function. And we can also define the servos attached to that function. So for instance, here I've got a basic throttle function. It's tied to my stick A, which is my throttle stick. I've got a trim control set up. We'll have a look in this setup curve in a second. We've got failsafe. I'm not going to worry about it in this video. And we've just got one servo assigned to it for this example. Now, the important thing is for functions, the setup configuration here is probably the most important aspect of these radios, or the programming anyway. So in here we can control quite a few things for this function. So let's have a look. Now I have made a video on functions, so you might want to have a look at that. One of my earlier videos goes through all these parameters here and shows you how to play with them and whatever. So the main thing for this introductory video on flight modes is when we want to use separate flight modes, you've got to make sure this particular parameter here, the flight mode parameter, is set to single. So when we switch it to single, what happens is basically this screen changes depending on what flight mode we've chosen. So, you know, you've got 13 different flight modes with the core. Every time you flick to a different or switch to a different flight mode, these parameters here can be altered for that flight mode. So they can be all configured for different flight modes. So for instance, we've got, I'll just start at the bottom, we've got the runtime of the servos. So this can delay our servos, maybe for some scale features, sometimes for landing gear, other things like, for instance, flaps, you can do it here as well. There's exponential, so I'm sure most of our viewers are familiar with exponential settings. So we've got a choice here where we can change from 3 different values of exponential. We've got individual left and right, of course. And when we switch to a different flight mode, we basically get another choice of another set of 3 exponential values. So you can see with each flight mode, you've got 3 different expos that you can choose from. So if you've got like total of 13 flight modes times 3, you can see we've got quite a few exponential settings. Not that many people would probably use that many different expo settings. If I go up a little bit further, we've got a parameter called rate. So the rate affects basically this graph here. So this graph basically gives us a representation of our servo movement. So if I move my throttle stick, you'll see the blue vertical line. that's just basically traveling with my throttle stick, and that's just mimicking the position of my throttle stick. So at full low throttle stick, I've got minus 100% output on the servo. Of course, this is just a default model. And then if I go full stick, we've got plus 100% travel. So this straight line here, the diagonal, the light grey line, that shows us how the servo moves. So at the moment, it's just moving in a linear fashion from bottom stick to top stick. And yeah, that's just basically giving us our servo throw, if you like. Now we can change that curve, so you can actually do that in here. And again, if you look at my videos on the functions, you'll see how we can do that. I'll just quickly go in here and put a few points in. Let's start off a couple of points just to make a bit of a zigzag curve, just so you can see a bit later how when we switch flight modes, how we can change the curve. So let's reduce the throttle at the top. So we only got about 60% at the top. So when I go to full stick, the throttle servo is now only going to move to 60% of its normal travel in the positive direction. So if we go back, you can see that's our resulting sort of dogleg curve. Not really indicative of a normal model, but you know, for this example, it'll show us how we can switch the curves in and out. Now, remember we're in the standard flight mode, so just keep that in the back of your mind for now. So all these parameters here can be altered per flight on a flight mode basis. So that's the big advantage of flight modes, is we can have different setups, say for throttle. You know, we have a separate function for, say, ailerons, elevators, rudders, gear, whatever. Each one of those entries can have completely different setup for the different flight modes. And the biggest advantage with a flight mode is we can just use one activation of, say, a switch, or even our throttle stick, or sorry, one of the other sticks. I know some pilots, for instance, when they do certain maneuvers, they push, say, aileron elevator stick to a corner, and they can activate another flight mode for a particular maneuver. And then you can also enable that with and without a switch as well. So, you know, you flick a switch and basically your stick, your aileron elevator stick, if you push it to the corner, doesn't do anything. However, when you flick the switch, after you flick the switch, if you move the stick into the corner, you can then activate a particular flight mode. So that's handy for selecting different parameters. For instance, I know some of the guys do IMAC and that want to, you know, have pretty crazy roll rates or snap, say, an aircraft around on the spot sort of thing. And they can do that pushing the stick in the corner, activate the flight mode. The flight mode basically reconfigures the aircraft, and all of a sudden it becomes, you know, crazy animal versus being a docile, you know, animal, so to speak. Okay, let's go back to our flight mode screen quickly. Let's go into there. So at the moment, we've just got the one flight mode, and we haven't set up any switches. We haven't set up a second flight mode. Now, one other thing to be aware of, this particular diagram here, a lot of people get a little bit confused with it, but there's two parts to it, really. So we've got this linear section here. So you notice all the flight modes are just in a linear fashion. They just follow one after the other until we get to about here, and then it branches off in multiple directions. So we'll just ignore this for now. And if we come back to this section here where we've just got the linear section, because this is the easiest one to understand, basically we can have up to 5 flight modes here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And these are assorted in order of priority from left to right. So the highest priority flight mode is in this box here, and the lowest priority is over here. So the 5th one here on our right is the lowest priority. So what do I mean by priority? Okay, assuming we had all these flight modes programmed, the ones on the left take precedence over the ones on the right. So for instance, if this flight mode here was a particular flight mode, however, we might have this one activated, so this might be active. If we then go and activate this flight mode, this will automatically replace this flight mode. So it'll jump to the second one as it's got a higher priority over the 4th one. If you've got the second one activated, these last 3 remaining flight modes cannot activate because this one's activated. So they can't override this flight mode. So typically in a lot of my settings, or a lot of my aircraft, my first flight mode or the highest priority might be one where I kill the engine, for instance, for a particular reason. Or I might have the model in a particular safety situation where you can't operate the throttle, the motor's locked out, especially with my internal combustion engines. So you'll notice a lot of my models, the highest priority flight mode is basically an engine kill situation. And I'll have the model in a particular setup configuration where it's totally safe. Okay, now if we move to the right, the priorities get a little bit more complex. Well, not so much the priorities, maybe the switching. So actually I'll go back here and let's talk a little bit about the switching. So how do we get to the different flight modes? Well, we have to assign some sort of way of switching to the flight mode. Now, typically we would use, say, a toggle switch. But you don't have to use a toggle switch. We can use telemetry. So, for instance, again, if you look at my one of my videos where I discuss a nitro internal combustion engine, like a throttle safety mechanism, or basically a safety throttle for internal combustion motor. In that particular example, I actually switch one of the flight modes using a virtual switch. So it's not actually a physical switch, it's a virtual switch. And I said, you can also use telemetry. So if you've got a telemetry control, you can use that to trigger a flight mode. If we go and actually have a look. So for instance, let's pick on the one in the middle here, the middle priority. And if we have a look at the inputs, we've got input, for instance, here we can just select the switch. So switch J. I can select the linear control, stick C, so I can set a switching point on my, in this case, my elevator stick. We can also have virtual switches. So virtual switches are really handy, for instance, if you want, say, multiple switching points on a stick, or if you want a condition where you want 2 switches to be activated before the virtual switch is triggered, things like that. You can get quite complex setups with the virtual switches. And I also mentioned telemetry. Again, we could use a telemetry control feature of this radio. I can't think of an example at the moment off the top of my head, but you might have a situation, for instance, I mentioned the safety throttle on my internal combustion engine. You could do something similar, say, with a turbine model where you're monitoring, say, exhaust gas temperature. You can trigger a particular flight mode when the exhaust gas temperature gets to a certain value or whatever. Like I said, I can't think of a good example for telemetry, but I'm sure some of you guys have probably used it. And then we've got the fixed values. So this is just a straight on-off facility. Probably not so much handy for flight modes. Typically a lot of us would use a switch. So let's pick on this switch here, switch J, only because it's easy for me to reach. So we click on OK, and it gives us a point where we tell it which position do we want this particular flight mode to be active. So let's pick on the middle position. So I'll just say on there and off. So we've got on, off, off, middle position is on. And if you notice carefully, you'll notice the green lines highlighted this particular flight mode here. So if I turn the switch off, or this flight mode off, it'll default back to the original standard flight mode, which is the least significant priority, which was in the top right-hand corner of the screen. So you notice that's sort of the default standard flight mode, if you like. Now, so we don't get confused, we better rename this one here. So let's call this one just flight mode number 3, only because it's the third one along in the boxes. And I'll talk about this a bit later. So here we go, flight mode 3, and you'll notice the top of the screen, it's mimicking the switch, the flight mode. So flight mode 3, and then we've got the standard flight mode. So switch in flight mode 3, away we go. Now we mentioned priority, so I'll show you that in action in a second. So we've got switch J, this switch here, activating flight mode 3 in the center position. Fairly self-explanatory, that's fairly basic. Okay, let's go back to our standard and we'll scroll across again to this linear section of the flight mode trees. And let's have a look at, say, the highest priority one. Let's pick on that one. Again, I'll pick a switch, but this time I'm going to pick a different switch. I'll pick this switch over here, which is switch E. And we'll do the same for this one. Activate this particular flight mode in position, or in the middle position. And let's rename that to, say, flight mode 1. Like capitals, FM1. Okay, so with this switch now, if I turn it off, it should go back to the standard flight mode. Then activate it, we go to flight mode 1. Now, remember how we said, I was talking about priorities. So this particular flight mode is basically the third priority down from this primary one here. So this flight mode 1's got the highest priority. So let's see what happens when I flick this switch to try and activate flight mode 3 when flight mode 1 is currently active. So again, flight mode 1 is currently active. Let's see what happens when I try and activate flight mode 3. And you'll notice nothing happens. And that's because the priority FM1 has got a higher priority than FM3. So it'll never switch into the FM3. So once FM1's activated, that's it. You cannot activate any of the following flight modes to the right of FM1. And same goes if we operate, say, FM3. So we've got flight mode 3 activated. So this switch is in the middle position. However, I can easily override it with flight mode 1, again, because it's got a higher priority. So there you go, bingo. Flight mode 1 is now active. So that's handy to remember. And that applies to the whole tree, or this graphical representation of all the flight modes. So if any of these flight modes were active, if we activated flight mode 1, that would override all the other flight modes. And you can work your way down. So if we had flight mode 2 in here, that would be a higher priority than FM3 and all the other ones to the right. However, FM1 still overrides FM2, and so on and so on. So that's fairly self-explanatory. So that sort of applies to these first 5 sequential flight modes. And they're pretty easy to switch because basically you have one switch and it's either on or off. It's fairly simple, pretty easy to understand. We can, switch in. You'll notice the light green line, which is indicating the current flight mode switching logic. And that's fairly self-explanatory. It gets a bit tricky as we move to the right over here, where we branch off and we can have multiple switches activating different flight modes. And a combination of these switches to get the path to the right flight mode can get quite convoluted or quite complex. However, as a bit of a saviour, there's a member on the PowerBox forums called RC Fox. And he's written a little document, I think it was a PDF, and I'll put up a link in the description of this video. So if you're a member of the PowerBox forum, if not, you can always join up. I'll give you the link so you can download his little document, because it really goes into explaining how to do the switch logic to select the various options of 13 different flight modes. I suggest you have a look at that document because it's really, really good. It lays out all the switching logic. So obviously this first section here is pretty easy to understand, but as we move over to here, you can have one switch here, and depending on where that switch is thrown, we'll select various flight modes. Actually, let's just assign a switch now. Let's assign the bottom one here. So go OK, and we'll just use the bottom position. So you notice as I toggle around, oops, that's probably not the best example, but you notice we've got a flight mode up there, and then if I flick it all the way down, we now have that flight mode. But this switch J also is assigned to here to these flight modes as well, and depending on where, if we assign a switch here, we can then activate various different options, various different flight modes. And you can see, you've got to scratch your head a little bit to work out what's going on where. But again, I'll put that link up, download RC Fox's little document, and it'll make life a lot easier for you. So that's really handy when you're using quite a few different flight modes. Typically for the majority of my models, I'm just using the first 5 or so flight modes, because that, for a lot of models, that does me quite well. However, I know some of the guys that fly gliders and various other aircraft, they have quite a few flight modes. They might have up to 10. The hardest bit with flight modes is not working out what it can do. It's just more so how do you switch the flight mode in and out? Because, we've only got like 3 and 2-way toggle switches. You've got obviously the sticks and that. But, you can get pretty difficult, pretty tricky trying to remember all the different switch configurations and whatever to switch in, 13 different flight modes. So it can become quite a bit of a headache. Especially if you've got, say, one model that uses a lot of flight modes and then another one that doesn't, and you don't fly it for 3 months, and then you probably forget what switches need to be in what position to trigger various flight modes. But like I said, have a look at the link that I've put in the description field and download the document, because it'll save me hours and hours of video work trying to explain how to switch the different flight modes in and out in this section here especially. Okay, now probably one other thing before we sign off is I haven't mentioned probably another handy feature with flight modes is when we go into, actually I'll better show you this as well, but before I do that, let's talk about trims, because I want to mention trims here. So typically, you have a trim. So if this one, I've just set up a default trim here, nothing too special. And you can see I'm just holding down my trim lever. I don't have any audio selected, so it's nice and quiet. You can see it's moving the whole curve, only because I've told it to move the whole curve. Now with the trims, we can also select single in here. So this is similar to when you're looking at the curves in the function menu. Single allows you to have individual trims for each individual flight mode. So this is really handy. If you look at one of my videos where I talk about setting up flaps with slow deployment of elevator compensation, you'll notice there I used the trims in single mode. So basically, as we flick the different or select the different flight modes, we can select different trim positions. So that was handy in that example where you go fly, you deploy your flaps, and say my flap half position was a different flight mode, and I'd trim the pitch of the aircraft in that flight mode. And then when I flick out of that flight mode, say go to my normal flying position, say with 0 flaps, the trim's a different trim. And once you set it in the transmitter, then you don't have to worry about it. The flight mode automatically switches in a different trim. So it's really easy. You can do it while you're flying, obviously. You fly the model, flick into the half flap flight mode, adjust your trim out the aircraft. Once that's done, it's done. That's it. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So individual trims per flight mode, that's really, really handy. Now, one other thing before I show you that curve thing is when we had a look at the flight modes before, if I go back to the flight mode menu, and you'll notice there's this fade in or no fade in functions. So it's important to understand this no fade in functions with this time here. So a couple of my other videos have shown these examples. Again, that video where I do the flap deployment, slow flap deployment with the elevator compensation, I go into this in a bit of detail. So this fade in basically allows us to alter the response of the servos as we switch between the different configurations. So you can imagine you might have a setup where the servo's in a certain position, you flick a flight mode, and then the servo has to travel to a new position. If it's too quick, it might jerk the aircraft, which you don't want to do. So in a lot of cases, we want the servos to travel slowly to their new position, and you do that within this fade in feature here. So this time here and this fade in, no fade in functions allows us to adjust how fast the servos will move once the flight mode is activated. So when we go out of this flight mode into another flight mode, you have to go into the other flight mode and adjust its fade in time as well. So these times are only for the fade in time, not for the fade out. So just something to be aware of. And of course, there's an option here to not include servos in the fade in function. So for instance, if I pick on the throttle, for instance, we might have an aircraft and I flick the flight mode so I have a much reduced rate. I might be coming in for a landing, so I want my landing flight mode. So as we're coming in for a landing, we've got reduced rates on all the flight surfaces in this particular flight mode. However, when we flick into the landing flight mode, we don't want the throttle servo delayed. So you'd normally select the, you'd hit this positive button here or the add button and select our throttle servo, put it in here, and you can also add other servos in here or other output channels that you want. I shouldn't say servos. And what will happen now is the throttle function will not be delayed by the fade in function. So if we had, say, 2 or 3 seconds here, as we switch into the standard flight mode, so imagine that's called landing. So we're flying around, you've got normal response on all your flight surfaces. You then flick into your landing flight mode. It then slows down, say, elevator, aileron, and maybe your rudder servos as it's switching into the flight mode. So it's only doing it while it's switching into the flight mode until all the servos get to their current position, which the radio is commanding. They then switch to normal operation. But during that time frame, they'll be slowed down by 3 seconds. They'll be pretty slow. 3 seconds is a bit of a ridiculous value. But just to show you, you can go up pretty high. And the throttle will not be delayed at all. So the throttle itself, as you switch the flight modes over, it will just basically move without any interruption as per normal. So that's a real handy feature. So again, if you want to see it in action, go have a look at one of my earlier videos on the flap deployment with elevator compensation. Slow flap deployment with elevator compensation, I think is the title of the video. Have a look at that and I'll show you how to use that fade in function to control the flaps, for instance, as I'm changing the flight modes. Okie doke. So next thing is I want to show you some action on the curves. So again, if we go to the functions, if I go into the function curve, we'll have a look at the curves as we flick the different flight modes. I'll just put it back to my default and we'll go from there. Sorry about that. The video camera battery just died, so I just had to swap the battery, so there's a bit of a glitch in the video. So again, we're on flight mode 3, so I'm changing the settings only for flight mode 3. Hey, that curve looks pretty cool. I can, let's reduce the rate to 80%. Okay, so now we've got, again, this is only for my throttle servo. If I go to, say, flight mode 1 again, we've got that funny curve that we set up with the run times of 0.4 and 3 seconds, expo rate of 40%. Let's flick in flight mode 3. You notice now we've got a rate of 80%. I haven't got any expo, I've got 100% expo for left and right sides of the curve. And we've got some new run times of 12 seconds and 7 seconds. Then if we go to the standard flight mode, we go back to the default values of 0 seconds for the run time, no exponential, and 100% rate. So you can see just flicking in one switch, we can change a whole lot of parameters for this particular function. Another thing is most people don't realize is we can have another throttle function here. If I just call it the same, the radio doesn't mind. Oops, yes it does. So I can't call it the same. So let's call it throttle number 2. Not to be confused with the dual throttle setup. And again, I can have the same stick. Excuse me. Can have the same trim control. So basically what I'm doing is I'm copying the function exactly the same as it currently is. So we'll just use the same throttle servo, servo number 1. So basically what I've got here is 2 separate functions. However, they're exactly the same, right? So what you can do is in one of the flight modes, we can disable, say, this function and then activate this function, and this can have a whole nother set of different parameters. So you can actually switch between different functions. And all you need to do to kill a particular function in a flight mode is reduce this rate here. If we have 0% rate, Basically, the servo will be stuck in its center position. And we can also offset the curve. So if you want it, say at minus 100 or plus 100, we can do that as well just by editing the curve. But in effect, what that does, having a 0% rate, it disables that function in this flight mode. So if we're in standard flight mode, this top throttle does not work anymore. However, we now have access to the second one. So basically the second one can be set up to be active in that flight mode and various other flight modes as well. So it's just something to be aware of. So for instance, you might have, say, a various situation where you might have probably the throttle's not really the best example. But for instance, you have, say, ailerons, you might have some split ailerons and you want the ailerons to work in a couple of flight modes. You just want basic ailerons. And then when you have set another flight mode, you want to bring in those extra ailerons to, act like a full span aileron or whatever. You can have your normal aileron, say, on the first function and then your full span on the second function. You can disable the second function in most of your flight modes and then activate it in a particular flight mode without impacting the original aileron function. So something to play with anyway, bit of a handy feature for some. So flight modes again, don't forget the link that I've posted in the description field, which shows you how to set up switches here to activate the various flight mode configurations. So what that's really handy for is it gives you an example of, say, a 3x3 setup. So you have a three-way switch selecting, each switch will select 3 different flight modes. And basically it gives you a 3x3 or a total of 9 flight modes in total. And you can go up to all up to 13, obviously. But again, it gets pretty hard to remember all the different flight modes while you're flying. You obviously, if you're using 13 completely independent flight modes, you'd want to be flying that model a fair bit to remember which way to throw the switches, so to speak. Anyway, hopefully you've learned a little bit about flight modes if you didn't really know much about them. I know there's a lot of users that are quite good at flight modes and been using them for years. And like I said, a lot of heli pilots, for instance, have been using flight modes for many, many years. So for them, it's it's just another standard feature of a radio. Whereas some of the fixed wing guys, probably haven't been exposed to flight modes as much. I know a lot of people, use rates, dual rates, for instance, or triple rates. So just think of a flight mode as being, different rates, but with a whole lot of other different features you can also switch in at the same time. Simple as that. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.